As you know, there's two times a year, I always take the time to celebrate who we are as a country, to celebrate our history. Whether it be Independence Day or Thanksgiving, I always want to take the time to recognize God's good hand over this nation. The American story is one of the greatest national stories, second or paralleled with Israel only. But what God has done in this nation is, in those formative years, and how God oversaw the creating of this great nation, is nothing less than a God story. Now, you may have been told something very different. That may even just irk you a little bit, because now it just sounds like some kind of Christian nationalist or something like that. But it is undeniable that God's providential hand was overseeing what would become America. And that the men and the women involved in this beginning trusted, depended on God. And so every year I take 2 Sundays to celebrate that, and just to bring to your attention some of the history, some of the things that are not being taught in our school system or academia. And so when I do that, and I don't remember exactly what I taught this time last year, but there's one thing you can rest assured, one thing that is, which is true, and that is I probably plagiarized and copied all my content from a great ministry called Wall Builders. This ministry is based out of Dallas. This is a ministry or an organization that stands for religious freedom. They're all about making sure that Americans understand the purpose of the Constitution. They encourage and empower and equip Christians to get involved in civil governance and to influence legislation and to keep alive the American story. And War Builders are the leading organization that does this. And I'm a huge fan. I love these guys very much. And so rather than me just reading through all their books and plagiarizing a sermon for you this morning, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to fly the guy out. That's just going to be a lot easier for me. And so this morning, I have a special guest who's going to share a patriotic message, a message about Thanksgiving. Now, War Builders, they have so many resources. Unfortunately, I was hoping that they would have a whole bunch of their resources here this morning that you guys could buy and pick up on the way out. But due to a UPS or whoever we want to blame, I don't know if it's UPS. That's not fair of me to say that. Probably was, because I had a bad experience recently with them, and I need an outlet to vent my frustration. But they're not going to make it here, unfortunately. They're running a couple of days late. But with everything you're going to hear this morning, you're going to want to visit warbuilders.com. This is the greatest resource on American history. And the founder of War Builders, and by the way, I'm saying Wall Builders because I got rebuked sternly by many congregants after first service for saying War Builders. Well, that's what they thought I was saying. It's Wall Builders. Are we good with that? Okay? All right. You guys listen a lot better than first service. I'm not a big fan of the first service folk. You know that. So I would really encourage you to visit their website. They've got just great resources, especially if you're a homeschooling family or you just want to have some good curriculum and information. Our guest will share some of that with you. But I've done ministry with War Builders for about 15 years or so. The founder, David Barton, and his son, who was the president of the organization, Tim Barton, just a great wealth of critical information. And so this morning, I've asked Tim to be here. He's going to share with you. I've had the opportunity to spend some time with Tim. I got to spend some time on the ranch with him back in Dallas, and we got to shoot some guns together, which is how you forge any relationship with another man. I love his family, have just a great heart, a great passion. And I will say this because it's important. It's really important to be accurate historically. We can't have a confirmation bias. We can't dress things up in a way that is favorable. We have to be as precise as we can to understand things correctly. History matters, and telling the right story matters because it helps us understand who we are. And so with what Tim is going to share with you today, this isn't just another narrative. This isn't a bias. This isn't a slant. This is historically sound information that you're going to hear this morning. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Tim Barton to the stage. Brother.
Thank you, sir. It's my pleasure to be with you. What he was saying was wall builders. We are an organization, we took our name from the Bible book of Nehemiah. If you remember the story of Nehemiah, he was the cupbearer to the king, Jerusalem had been torn down, and he was grieved, and he wanted to go back and rebuild his home, and he led an effort, and I feel like it's important also to clarify where our name comes from, because when you're in Texas and you have a name like Wall Builders, people instantly assume, right, Southern Borders, you guys. No, we do nothing with that. As we get going, obviously, as we are getting ready to approach Thanksgiving, as Americans, this is one of my favorite times of the year, but as a Christian, this also should be one of the most important holidays for you because the Bible is so full of guidance and encouragement. In 1 Thessalonians, that in everything we give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you. Part of our posture as believers should be one of giving thanks. And it's worth noting that as we talk about giving thanks, it's a recognition of the blessings that we have that we've received from God, but sometimes those blessings aren't always the way that American culture portrays them to be. Because, for example, we can go back and the Pilgrims are the ones that start the tradition of Thanksgiving in America. But if you know the story of the Pilgrims, their first Thanksgiving wasn't them thanking God for abundance. Things weren't wonderful. And if you go further, Thanksgiving didn't become a federal holiday until 1863. Abraham Lincoln made Thanksgiving a federal holiday. If you know history, 1863 is right in the middle of the Civil War. It's interesting because the Thanksgiving holiday in America had far more to do with who God was than it did with the circumstances and the lives of individuals. It's very interesting, and as believers, like this also should be part of our thought and our posture, but why also this matters is because, as Pastor Morgan alluded to, we are in an era where everything about American history, people are like, nope, canceled, right? We shouldn't honor and celebrate them, and there's levels of irony to it. Someone who is a historian, studies history, there's levels of irony in some of the accusations that come out. Because if there was a group of people you wanted to cancel for not being good people, and you picked the Pilgrims, you picked one, like if you were like Jamestown, I'd be like, you have a pretty good point, right? Like there's some places you can make the argument, but the leading narrative today is that Thanksgiving should be replaced and these people were bad. And this is what's being taught in public schools right now. It's what's being taught in universities right now. And the fact that we have people believing it is only an indication of how little of the truth we actually know of the story. And I want to take you on a journey to go back and tell history, but ultimately what we're doing as we go through this journey of history is I want to show you so many of the God connections along the way that are very well documented, but are underreported today. And so, for example, go back to the Pilgrims. When the Pilgrims first come, if you remember, they were a church congregation from England. And to set some context for you, in England was an Anglican nation. And this is the era that every king would choose a denomination, and that was their official state or country's religion. If you were in Germany, you were Lutheran. If you were in Spain, you were Catholic. If you were in England, you were Anglican. And in England, they had a law that you were not allowed to meet and have like private Bible study. If there were more than 4 people in a meeting, you could be imprisoned unless you were Anglican having an Anglican meeting. Well, they weren't Anglican, and so it was against the law for them to meet and have Bible studies or church services. And this is also why Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn. William Penn was a Quaker. Why did he come to America? Because he kept getting thrown in prison over in England for their Quaker meetings, and his father was the Admiral William Penn, who was an admiral in the King's Royal Navy and had won multiple victories, and the king was going to give him a commission for winning all these battles and said, what if I just give you land in my new world? And so the father, Admiral William Penn, negotiated with the king to have his son removed from jail. He was like, hey, let's help each other out. You turn my son loose, helps me out. I'll send my son over to this new land you've given to me. That'll help you out. That's literally how Pennsylvania was formed. William Penn, as a Quaker, Pennsylvania was a Quaker colony early on, but it was because They were not allowed to have religious meetings in England. Well, this is how it was for the Pilgrims. They ended up going to Holland, and they were happy in Holland. Holland had more freedom, but Holland was secular. And they didn't want their kids growing up embracing secularism. And so they said, we want to go somewhere else. They ended up coming to America. They had to get a charter from the king. And the charter for the king was for them to go to the Jamestown colony. But very providentially, as they're coming over, they leave England in September. They don't arrive till November, and winter storms had already set in, and it blew them off course to where when they land in Plymouth, they're out of food, they're out of clean water. They arrive somewhere where there is no shelter. There's not firewood cut, there's not homes built, and snow's already on the ground. And this is a very, very bad scenario. It was so bad for them that of the 100 pilgrims approximately that came, about half of them died that first winter. Now, this is also kind of interesting because it sets a context for it's the following year that they actually have a day of Thanksgiving. But their day of Thanksgiving, they weren't thanking God that they now were living this abundant, blessed American life. No. They were thanking God because they had learned how to grow crops. And they actually had food going into this winter, and their hope was, this winter we might not all die. We should thank God. Also, part of who they were thanking God for, they didn't know how to survive in the New World, but very providentially, God had brought them a friend. And if you don't know the story, go back. Somerset was the first one who was there, spoke English, and he didn't speak very much. Said, I have a friend, I'll bring a friend back. And when Somerset returned, he returned with Chief Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag Indians, with Squanto and several others. Well, Squanto spoke English, chose to live with him for 2 years. Governor Bradford said that he was a gift to us sent by God. Bradford wrote that in his journal, and Squanto taught them how to survive in the New World, how to fish, how to hunt, how to grow crops. That first winter, when they decided they were going to have a day to thank God, and I'm saying first winter, this is 1621, so it's their first time going into winter, they've been there. When they decide to have a day of Thanksgiving, they invite the Wampanoag Indians to join them. Chief Massasoit came with 90 of his male Indian braves, and for 3 days, they had a Thanksgiving feast. They actually had athletic competitions, they had races and wrestling matches, they had shooting competitions. For 3 days, they feasted. What's also kind of interesting about this is this is historically documented as well. Of the pilgrims who had survived, there's about 53 of them. The Plymouth Historic Society actually has a list of all of their names and even how old they were. So there's these little kids, and then there's some adults, and there's men and women, and then there's the elderly. There's 53 of them total. Well, Chief Massasoit came with 90 Indian braves, and that's a lot of mouths to feed. Well, that's not a problem because the majority of the food provided the first Thanksgiving was brought by the natives. They're the ones that brought the majority of food. Now, part of why even knowing some basic details of the story matters is because part of what kids are learning in school today is that the first Thanksgiving, where the pilgrims were thanking God that they were able to kill the Indians. And I'm like, hang on a second, right? Or that the pilgrims stole land from the natives. Again, I'm like, hang on. The first Thanksgiving, there were 90 male Indian brave warriors. There was 53 pilgrims, men, women, children, elderly. If those natives had any thought that these pilgrims were bad, stealing our land, doing us harm, that first Thanksgiving could have gone very differently, right? Not only was it a peaceful 3 days, the majority of the food was brought by the natives. And I'm giving this again as an indication. It's interesting as people of faith. If you go back and read Genesis, when the serpent first appears, the first thing the devil says in Scripture, it was a challenge to truth, right? Did God really say? Why? Because if the devil can get us to believe a lie, then we can fall victim to things that are produced by those lies. And I'm saying this not even in a sense of trying to defend American history. I'm just pointing out there's a lot of lies being told, and this is not part of the reality of even our story, but let me go forward. Because after the pilgrims have the first Thanksgiving, one of the things that it kind of sets a tone and precedent for is that Thanksgiving becomes a more normal thing in America. From that point forward, there were times when people would have a day of prayer and thanksgiving, thanking God, set aside on their calendar. But also, in 1623, Governor Bradford pointed out that they had gone and planted crops. Squanto would help them know how to do this and how to navigate. But when they planted their crops, that year, there was no rain, that spring. By May of that spring, there had been no rain. And if you've ever tried to plant crops, you got to have some water, right? And they don't have like a faucet they're turning on, irrigation system. No, they literally have to have rain. And they realize that if we don't have rain, we don't have crops, and then we might not survive this coming winter. And so Governor Bradford called for a colony-wide day of prayer and fasting, asking for God to intervene. And what's really cool, there's actually records, this was reported from several people in their own writings. Again, the Plymouth Historic Society has all this documented, but you can go back, even Governor Bradford's journal, readily available online. You can find this in his journal as well. But one of the reports says that as they were praying, there was a small cloud that came and it sat over the field, and for 24 hours it misted on the field. Like not everywhere else, over their crops for 24 hours. And then after that gentle mist, it was a couple days later, and then the normal rains returned. Now, also, it's kind of a big deal if you are familiar with crops. If you plant seeds and you have a hard spring rain, and those seeds haven't taken root, it's all getting washed out. But you have a 24-hour mist, and it soaks in, and roots take, and then you get a good rain. Now you're okay. Well, there was a group of natives, and again, this is well documented from some of the pilgrims who were there. There was a group of natives that came up and said, okay, we need to talk to you. We know y'all set aside a day and you had this time of prayer. We need to know what you prayed because we think it'd be really helpful for us to know how to bring rain. And the pilgrims were able to start sharing with them what happened. Now, if you go back and read the Mayflower Compact, which is their founding governing document they wrote before they got off the Mayflower, the opening paragraph says, for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, we mutually bind ourselves together in a civil government politic. The reason they were coming was to advance the Christian faith. And so in these moments, they were able to share the Christian faith about who God was, what God had done, what they had seen and witnessed. And this set a precedent in America that it was very common. Like these days of Thanksgiving, if you go forward to the founding fathers, every single founding father that was a governor would have days of prayer and thanksgiving. In the same way that the pilgrims did prayer and fasting, every single founding father who was a governor would have days of prayer, fasting, humiliation, where they're crying out to God. And also, like this is a very biblical thought, because as Christians, we're told all throughout Scripture, you enter into his gates with thanksgiving, you enter his courts with praise. Like Thanksgiving is supposed to be a normal part of our life. Well, also fasting, Jesus taught the disciples, when you fast, don't be like the Pharisees. Well, the implication, if he's saying when you fast, the idea is, well, of course you're going to fast. And when you do it, make sure you have the right attitude and heart behind it. This is a normal part of Christian life, and this was actually a normal part of America, so normal that if you look back historically, by 1815, there had been more than 1,400 official government prayer proclamations done by presidents, by governors, and even by Congress. And why this is a really good thing to remember is because today, it's not unusual that someone says, well, the founding fathers, or early America, that they were largely irreligious, they were secular, they wanted a separation of church and state, they were atheists, agnostics, deists, whatever the accusation is. I love to point to this as just a super, super easy example and say, okay, so if the argument is they weren't religious or they were atheists, agnostics, and deists, then why did they pray all the time, right? Like you are not a very good atheist, agnostic, and deist if you're calling for days of prayer. You've confused what that means, because an atheist says there is no God. An agnostic says we don't really know if there's a God. A deist says there is a God, but he doesn't get involved in our world today. If you're an atheist, agnostic, and deist, you know what you would never do? That. Not even one of them, much less 1,400. At our organization, we have what's considered the largest private collection of original documents from early American history. We have the largest collection of documents from Plymouth, from Jamestown. We have tens of thousands of documents from the founding fathers. We have over 800 of these original prayer proclamations. So this is stuff, as I'm saying this is not only incredibly well documented, this is something that you actually can get online and find a ton of this stuff too. It's just that it's not talked about and it's not reported. And it might be worth asking why, because if you go back, for example, if we went back and read some letters, John Adams has a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1813. You can look this up today, where John Adams is reflecting back, because 1813, this is like 40 years past when the founding fathers first got together. And he says to Jefferson, remember when we were first together as young men, we just had this vigor for life. He said, and when we all met together, we argued all the time. We disagreed about so much. He then says, but we did find common ground. And there's 3 paragraphs where he talks about the common ground they found. Here's part of his explanation for where they found common ground. He said the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the principles of Christianity. You're suggesting, like John Adams is saying, the thing that we were able to find unity and work together on were the principles of Christianity. That seems like a pretty bold statement from John Adams, and it is bold, but only based on what we have learned in our education system. If you go back and actually read some earlier historic documents, easy example, what used to be taught in public schools, you can go back to someone like Alice Baldwin. She was a professor at Duke University. She actually started the women's program at Duke University. She was there in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, but in 1928, she wrote a book called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. And in this book, she identified that some of the most significant voices in early America were actually pastors. And pastors were so influential on America, even the founding fathers. And what she points out in her book is that if you look at the Declaration, there's not a single issue in the Declaration that had not been first preached from American pulpits prior to 1763, where she then concludes that when the founding fathers got together and came up with their ideas, they didn't have any unique ideas. They were simply repeating what they had learned from their pastors for decades leading into that moment. Now, this seems like a pretty bold thing to say the founding fathers were influenced by pastors. Again, it's only bold if you actually haven't studied that much of their history and writings, because if you actually go back, the very first time the founding fathers met was September 6, 1774. And the very first motions made, they come together in a meeting, first motion made by Thomas Cushing. He's from Massachusetts. The opening motion was that they open with prayer. Now, that doesn't seem crazy, but they discussed it. They agreed. They said, let's call for the local pastor, the Reverend Jacob DeShay. He came and he led them in the opening prayer. There's a famous painting done depicting their opening prayer service. And this is the painting. If you don't recognize the posture, clearly that's a prayer meeting. But the records of Congress, in fact, even John Adams wrote this to Abigail, the records of Congress indicate that that opening prayer lasted for 2 hours. I don't know how spiritual you feel this morning, but if we were to suggest, hey guys, the next 2 hours we're going to pray, like I love Jesus, we talk all the time, we're friends, but I would like to have a heads up before I go into a 2-hour prayer meeting. I need to mentally prepare myself for this moment. Well, this isn't even like the spiritual leaders of the nation. These are the politically chosen leaders. And this is how much faith was pertinent to them, that they open with prayer. And in fact, what John Adams wrote to Abigail is not only did they open with prayer, and by the way, this is in the records of Congress, not just John Adams' writings, but in the midst of their prayer, somebody suggested we should read the Bible as well. And so the Reverend Jacob DeShay pulled out the Anglican prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer, because in it has assigned verses for every day of the week. So it's a Bible reading plan. And there were 4 chapters that were assigned for that day. Well, one of the chapters, John Adams told Abigail, he says, it's as if God himself had ordained that to be read that morning. Here's part of what he encouraged Abigail. I must beg you to read that psalm. Read the 35th Psalm to your friends. Read it to your father. Psalm 35 is one of the psalms that David wrote while Saul was chasing him, trying to kill him. And David says, God, I've done nothing, and he seeks my destruction. Lord, you rise up, be my shield and my buckler, my strong right arm. On he goes for more than 30 verses. And when the founding fathers read it that morning, they were like, that's for us. Like this is God speaking to us. Now, to give context, they had also found out the night before that the British Navy had surrounded Boston Harbor and had begun bombarding into Boston Harbor, like firing into Boston, which also then makes sense why the next morning they're like, I think we should open with prayer. And they do. But then they're reading in like Psalm 35 and like they're like, we're David. Like we've done nothing and they're attacking us. God, we need you in this moment. Well, John Adams writes Abigail another letter and he tells her one of the things that Congress did. He said, we've appointed a continental fast. Now this is Congress calling on all of the nation to a time of prayer and fasting. John Adams told Abigail, millions will be upon their knees at once before their great creator, imploring his forgiveness and blessings, his smiles on American Council in Arms. Now, this is John Adams saying, Abigail, it's going to be incredible. Millions of people are going to be praying. There were only about 3 million colonists at that time. So John Adams is thinking like everybody's going to pray. That's probably naively ambitious. I don't think probably every American prayed, but it does give an indication of what even John Adams thought about the culture of the time, that if there's a call to prayer, like in America, we believe in prayer. People are going to respond to this call to prayer. What's fun is as you track this is the first of the congressional prayer proclamations, but there were 15 of these during the American Revolution. And there were two different kinds of prayer proclamations. The first was for prayer and fasting, as we're noting, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, but they would also do proclamations of prayer and thanksgiving. And this is, again, kind of like a head nod back to what the Pilgrims started, that early precedent that you'd have days of prayer and fasting, days of prayer and thanksgiving. Well, this is what leads to this idea of them doing this like all the time, because they did. Every single founding father that became a governor, they did these as governor. Every single one without exception. This was a very normal thing in America, but the very first one that Congress did was for prayer and fasting. And when Congress did this, it's also kind of fun that John Adams writes Abigail another letter. And I'm referencing a lot of John and Abigail Adams letters, partly because they document this very well, but also because it's very easy to find. Because you just look up the letters of John and Abigail Adams. From the Revolution to the end of their life, they wrote 1,100 letters back and forth. So it's a couple volume set of books, easy to find. And if you are someone who likes Hallmark movies, you would love their letters. Because John is a hopeless romantic. Abigail Adams is amazing, brave, courageous woman, also super romantic. And just to give you an idea of this, John Adams has a letter where he says, Abigail, I'm suffocating because I haven't seen you in a week and a half and you are the air that I breathe. And if I saw that in a movie, I'm changing the channel. That's dumb, right? Like, no, that's not real life. Well, this was their life, okay? This is like the way they interacted. Well, it's so interesting. John writes Abigail a letter and says, Abigail, he says, it's amazing the things we are already seeing happen. He says the British came, and it's in this letter, it's like this long paragraph with nothing but all these unlikely things happening. He says the British came to the town, and the men of the town formed a militia, and they repelled the British. The British are the number one military in the world at that time. The men of the town formed a militia. That means like the rednecks got their guns, right? And they're like, you're not coming in. And as a like self-identified redneck, like at some point we're like, oh yeah, we would take care of it, no problem. That's probably a little ridiculous considering this is a actual professional military, right? Like if the Delta Force shows up, right, SEAL Team 6, like we ain't doing nothing. Right, this is not going to go well. This is their reality. And John Adams is like, they repelled them. He then says, Colonel Smith was in this fort, and the British attacked the fort, and Colonel Smith repelled them from the fort. He then says, my favorite part, he says there was a naval exchange, and we destroyed a 64-gun British man of warship and a 20-gun British man of warship. Those are naval vessels that had 64 cannons and 20 cannons. That's way more impressive because we didn't have a navy yet, okay? Now, again, keep in mind, Great Britain is the number one military power in the world because they have the number one navy in the world. When we separate, they have the navy. We don't have a navy. We had some businessmen who had boats. And so we would take whatever cannons we could find and we'd put them on the boats that we had. But like these weren't official naval vessels. To give you perspective, if you ever go to Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Museum of American History, up on the third floor, they have one of the very first ships of the American Navy. It's called the Gunboat Philadelphia. This is where the American Navy begins. Now, John Adams says, Abigail, it's amazing. We destroyed a 64-gun British man of warship and a 20-gun British man of warship. My question is, how? Did you row really fast in their direction? Like this makes no sense at all, and that was the point. John Adams was saying, it's crazy what we are seeing have happen. He then wrote her a letter not long after, and he says, Abigail, I was eating dinner tonight, and there were men at a table eating dinner behind me, and they were discussing all these unlikely things that we've been talking about. And one of the men was talking about how we're just the most fortunate, lucky group that's ever been, and there was a man there who corrected him. And he said, no, it's something else. And what he explained, I think is probably the best explanation for what's going on. Here's what was explained that John Adams thought was the best explanation. It appears to me the eternal Son of God is operating powerfully against the British nation. So somebody's like, we're the luckiest group ever. And somebody's like, no, that's Jesus. Right? That's interesting because John Adams says, and I agree with that. Why? Why does that matter? Because this is clearly not the sentiment coming from someone who is a secularist, right? Separation church and state, atheist, agnostic, deist. No, this is someone who understood. We've been crying and asking for God to intervene. And with all these unlikely things happening, I think Jesus is helping us right now, right? Like this is what makes the most sense, that God is moving on our side. And this letter was 1777. That's still early American Revolution. what's already been happening, like early revolution that's convinced them God might be on their side. Let me give you just a couple examples of what they had been seeing. About a month and a half, 2 months after the Declaration, you have one of these really big major battles, the Battle of Long Island. At the Battle of Long Island, the British arrived and they had 30,000 troops against Washington and 9,000 in the Continental Army. And back then, everybody's shooting a single-shot musket, smooth bore, not inherently very accurate, very far. Like this is a very primitive way of fighting. And when you're outnumbered 3-1, this isn't like, no, our guys, we have the best military in the world. Well, I think we do now. We didn't used to. And even if we did have a really good military, you're still outnumbered 3-1, single-shot muskets. Numbers matter in this equation. They get pinned to the river in New York. And when they get pinned to the river is a mile wide. And so they're stuck. They're just waiting, trying to figure out what to do. While they are waiting, the records indicate from people who were there, their own journals, they talk about how crazy this was. It was a clear, sunny day. The British Navy began sailing their ships up the river because they were going to fully surround the Americans. And then, they're all going to be captured, and many of them would be killed. Washington, all the officers, they're going to be publicly hung for treason. It's not going to be a good scenario. As the Navy is sailing up the river, out of nowhere, a clear, sunny day, a storm blows in. And the wind was blowing down the river that it began to blow the British Navy back out into the harbor. The British Navy called a retreat because they did not want their ships to run aground and run into rocks and be sunk. So Washington recognizes as soon as the storm calms, the Navy's sailing right back up. So we have to get off this island tonight. Well, when night falls, the storm calms. Washington tells his men, find anything that floats, because back then most Americans did not know how to swim. And even if you could, a mile across is a very long swim. So they're finding what they can that floats, and they find some canoes and flat bottom boats. And so they begin across and back all night. That's a mile across, a mile back, a mile across, a mile back. There's only so many people you can fit at a time in a canoe. So they're doing this all night. Well, there's 9,000 of them. By the time the next morning, off in the distance, the dawn of the next day is starting to come, there's 1,000 of them left. Washington is with that 1,000 because he had determined he's going to be the last one off the island. And so they're going, what are we going to do? And they know as soon as the sun appears, the British are going to see we're evacuating. They're going to advance. It's now 30,000 against 1,000. We're going to all be captured or killed. And then something else unlikely happened. A fog arose off the river. That's not super unlikely, except the fog then blew, and it settled between both camps. And one of the guys who was there, Major Benjamin Talmadge, he was the guy who went on to become the head of the Culper Spy Ring. He explained what happened that morning. This is from his writings. He said, a very dense fog began to rise, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well. And so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. Right? So like from me to the front row, 6 yards, he was like, you couldn't even see somebody at 6 yards. The fog was so thick. Well, the fog stayed there as they continued the evacuation of the last 1,000. When they load the last 3 boats, the 3 boats get to the middle of the river and the fog clears. The British realize the camp is empty. They charge. The British officers in their report identified they got to the edge of the river in time to see the last 3 ships arrive on the other side, and their assessment was the Americans had escaped and survived to fight another day. And this is when people look back and they were like, well, that was quite unusual, right? Like that worked out pretty well for us. And then you got to contemplate, like, so what are the odds on a sunny day? A storm blows in. And like the wind's blowing down the river, like they're blowing them out. And it stays, and then the night falls, and like we're in trouble. We got to find things that floats, and we do, and we start going across all night, but we're never going to make it in time. And morning's coming, and then the fog lifts, and it settles between us. And it stays there. So we the last 3 boats, we have the middle of the river, and then it lifts, and they come down, and I think, that's pretty high odds, right? Like that seems unusual. Well, you could see people try to explain this away if this had only happened once. But this kind of stuff started to happen over and over and over again that people recognize, I think God's helping us. Let me jump forward in the story and tell you more, because at the end of that year, December 1776, at this point, the Americans have not won anything really significant to speak of. Because even with Long Island, they didn't win that. God miraculously kept them alive, but they didn't win that battle. But by the time you get to the end of that year, all they've really done is had defeat. And specifically from that point, because they lost the Battle of Long Island, they lost Kips Bay, they lose the Battle of White Plains, they lose Fort Washington, they lose Fort Lee. They really lose all of New York. And why that matters is because back then there was only 1 year enlistments. And every enlistment is up on December 31st. And then you got to sign up for the next year. And so when you are signing up, Washington, as you can imagine, the challenge he's facing, he's like, guys, come on, we need to do this. But if you've been on a team and all you've done is like lose the whole time, I'm from Texas, like from the Dallas area. This is like me trying to convince you to be a Dallas Cowboys fan right now. Like, guys, this is going to be great. Like, we're going to turn this around. We're going to do, like, this is stupid. No, like, you're an idiot. That's crazy. It's never going to work. This is Washington's dilemma. And in the midst of this, morale, you can imagine, is incredibly low. People are already deserting because they're winter quarters. And winter quarters, they don't have the best conditions. Winter is there, and many of them are intense. And they've got to be thinking to themselves, I got a wife and kid back home. I have a home with a fireplace. What am I doing here? So they're already deserting camp, and Washington can't get anybody to re-enlist. So he knows we have to do something different. If we don't get a victory, we will never get people to sign up for round 2. And so he has an idea. On Christmas night, they're going to march on Trenton. And Trenton was a British fort that was being controlled by the Hessians. The Hessians were German mercenaries hired by the British. They're professional soldiers. But the one thing that is known about the Hessians is that they really did, on special occasions, they really like to have a good time. And so Washington's like, I got an idea. What if we wait till there's a night that we're thinking they're going to have a good time, and then we show up the next morning? I'm just going to say, like, if you had to pick a fight with somebody and you're like, I'm going to wait till that dude is passed out, unconscious, hangover on the floor, then I'm going to go kick him. Like, that's not a bad strategy if you had to win a fight, right? Like, wait, get yourself the advantage. Well, Washington's idea is to march on Trenton, and estimates were they had 12 to 1,500 men. So Washington thinks we're going to go and we're going to take maybe about 7,000, because they're going to have 3 armies that cross the Delaware, one that comes from the north. So they're going to surround Trenton, and so you have an overwhelming numerical force that's there. Well, as they start to work this plan, their idea is they're going to be across the Delaware by midnight. The guy who's actually in charge of the crossing where Washington was General Henry Knox. I'm going to come back and read a quote from him in just a minute. But as they're going, crossing the Delaware, where there are 3 armies, they're going to take 5,400 troops across. They're taking their cannons and their horses. Well, as they begin, on Christmas Day, they get to the river, and the winter weather conditions were terrible. It was so foggy, they couldn't see the other side. There was massive chunks of ice that were floating down. They would put these floats in, they're loading their men on, and there were chunks of ice bigger than the float that would then push the floats 1 or 2 miles downriver before they could finally get across, and they couldn't even see the other side because of the fog. So they're so delayed by what's happening that when Washington finally gets his men across, he does get 2,400 troops across in his location, but once he gets to the other side, he gets word that nobody else made it across. So the other 2 armies that are in that 5,400 troops that are coming, they're not coming anymore. And he knows, well, we have to have a victory or there's going to be no round 2. So we got to press on. So they decide they're going to press on. They don't get all the way across till 4 a.m. Well, now they have a 9-mile march, and they wanted to be there before sunrise. So like, surprise the Hessians. There's no way now you're going to be there by sunrise. But again, he knows we got to have a victory. So we're going to continue to advance all night. We're doing this. And as they continue the advance, to make matters worse on this 9-mile march, a blizzard blew in on them. And this is also at a time when if you signed up in the military, you were given a uniform, but they didn't have winter gear. And if you signed up and got your uniform in January, February, March, you might have already worn holes in your uniform. In fact, the records indicate that even many of the men had already worn through their boots, so much so that the British identified they could track the movement of the American soldiers at wintertime by the bloody footprints in the snow. Because many of them did not have even like burlap to wrap their feet with to keep their feet off of the ground. So this is one of those miserable moments. Well, in the midst of them making this march, there were actually 2 Americans that froze to death on the march on the way to Trenton. And you can imagine if you're there like, God, why are we dealing with this? What they didn't know is the blizzard was also at Trenton. And at Trenton, the guards on duty, the sentries, they came to their CO and said, sir, nobody's crazy enough to be out marching in this weather. Can we please come in and stay warm by the fires? And their commanding officer said, you know what, you're right. Nobody's moving in this weather. Come in and stay warm. So there's no way the Americans are going to make it before sunrise. But now there are no guards on duty, which is just super interesting. Well, they show up the next morning. They get set up. There's nobody watching the roads. There's nobody watching the fort. They surround the fort, and when they get set up, they announce themselves. It is a complete surprise. The Hessians were inside of the fort. That's important to know. Hessians are inside the fort. When the Americans announce themselves, the Hessians abandon the fort. and they run out. Different historians think, well, maybe they didn't know how many of the Americans were there, and they're going to try to flank them. All they did was run out right in front of all of the lines waiting with muskets. And so they're just getting mowed down. Well, the battle miraculously lasted only 35 minutes before it was over and they called for a surrender. In the midst of this, the Hessians are on the British side. So on Team British, the Americans killed approximately 20, captured about 1,000 or 100, and captured about 1,000. So incredible lopside on this. Well, on the American side, there were 3 that were wounded. Period. And this is when they were like, that went so good, right? Like, we did not see this coming. Well, it gets even more interesting. Because of the 3 that were wounded, there was 2 of them came from the small detachment. When they entered into Trenton, Washington, a small detachment to go guard the road in the edge of town to make sure that the Hessians couldn't send for reinforcements, and then the Americans would be in even more trouble. And so they were guarding the road in the edge of town, but as they're marching out on the road in the edge of town, they pass a townhouse and a dog begins to bark. And a man comes to the door. His name was Dr. John Riker. And he said, what are y'all doing? And they said, sir, we mean you no harm. We're closing down the road. Nobody can leave. We're the Continental Army. We're advancing on Trenton. And we're just keeping people in town. And he says, well, hang on a second. I'm a doctor, and I'm Team Patriot. If you're doing something, he said, I want to come with you. What he told them was, some poor fellow may need my assistance. So he grabbed his medical kit and he joined them. When the battle began at Trenton, the small detachment goes and rejoins. And actually, their lead officer of the small detachment, when he steps forward, he gets shot. He's wounded, but not fatal. He's going to be okay. But he's out. So the young officer behind him steps up. And so he's going to lead the small detachment. He got shot in the shoulder, but it went in and nicked an artery, and he starts bleeding out. But the doctor standing right beside him, the doctor put a finger in the hole to slow down the bleeding. He gets his medical kit. He ends up saving this guy's life. Why I'm telling you this story is this guy went on to become a pretty significant person in American history. If you've ever seen the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, he's the guy standing behind George Washington, and all those people on that boat are known individuals. Well, he's so well known, he went on to become the 5th president of the United States. His name was James Monroe. And again, people are looking there like, okay, so you're telling me the only dog that barked that night was the doctor, and the doctor sitting beside the only guy fatally wounded, and they're like, finger in the hole, and like, what? They're seeing this and they're going, this is crazy. And the people who were there said similar things. George Washington, he talked about how this was such a providential thing. But General Henry Knox, the guy who was in charge of that crossing, he wrote a letter to his wife explaining this. Here's what he told her. He said, the hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy was not unlike that which will be when the last trump will sound. Like when Christ comes and like, it's chaos, what's happening? He's like, that's kind of what it felt like. He said, Providence seemed to have smiled upon every part of this enterprise. He was there and said, God was a part of everything. Like, it was so obvious God was part of it. Well, that idea was so clear to so many people that were there in the revolution. In fact, George Washington, just a little over a year after this happened, he wrote General Thomas Nelson Jr. a letter, and he was explaining how obvious it was in his own eyes that God had been moving on the behalf of the Americans in the midst of this war. And this is part of what he told them. He said, the hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. So if somebody looks and they see all these things we're seeing in battle, if they can't acknowledge what God's been doing, they must be worse than a non-believer, an infidel, or more than wicked if they can't acknowledge God. Well, his next part is my favorite. He says, but it will be time enough for me to turn preacher when my present appointment ceases, and therefore I shall add no more on the doctrine of providence. Washington's like, I've seen enough miracles, I could become a pastor. But for now, I'm going to focus on winning this war, right? That was his sentiment. Well, this is what was so obvious to people who were there, is that God was a part of this story. In fact, when the American Revolution finally ends, jumping to the end, the American Revolution ends with the Peace Treaty of Paris. The 3 men on the screen are the ones who signed the peace treaty. On the left is John Jay, the middle is John Adams, on the right is Benjamin Franklin. These are the Americans that signed the peace treaty. The peace treaty is still on display up in Washington, D.C. It's at the State Department. It's on the 6th floor. It's known as the John Quincy Adams State Drawing Room. If you look at the bottom left, you see the signatures. The one with the blue ribbon is David Hartley. He was the British ambassador. But then you see John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay. What is so interesting about this document? This is the document that ended the American Revolution. It brought peace between us and Great Britain. It established America as a free and independent nation. Look at the title of this document. In the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity. Did you know America became a nation in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? That's on the title. Like, that is the weirdest title I've ever seen for a peace treaty. It is. It's possible somebody had recently read Proverbs 3, and all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll direct your steps. Because they literally put it on top of the document. Why I'm pointing this out is because the God part of the story, it's so obvious. It's in all of their writings and records if we would actually go back. In fact, once we became a nation, first, John Adams, this is part of why he's able to say that what we did, it was through the principles of Christianity, but once we become a nation, George Washington becomes president, and as president, he delivers what's considered the most significant political address ever done in his farewell address. In Washington's farewell address, he's giving advice to the nation on how they can succeed going forward, and he does give some really good advice. If you've never read it, you should read it. Some pretty practical things, like he says, hey, avoid debt, because that's not going to be good for us. He talks about avoiding foreign entanglements, focus on American issues. He says, love principle more than you love a party, because the love of party can be the bane, and like so much good advice. But the one I want to draw your attention to, he says, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity. Now, notice we're talking about political prosperity. As a nation, how can a nation succeed? And he said, of all the things that you can do to contribute to a nation succeeding, he said, religion and morality are indispensable supports. You can't succeed without religion and morality, he continued. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars. So if someone opposes or tries to overturn religion and morality, he says they don't love America, because that's what a patriot is, someone that loves their country, right? If you oppose, now that seems so interesting. Why would they say that? Well, the following year, John Adams became president. And John Adams then, he wrote a letter to the militia of Massachusetts, and the whole letter, it's like 4 or 5 paragraphs. It really is a great letter worth the read. The most famous line from that letter, he said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Our Constitution, our government, it only works with religious and moral people. It doesn't work any other way. Now, why would he say that? Well, it actually does make sense if you understand that our Constitution was built on we the people are in charge. We are the leaders, but also it's built on giving freedom to the people. If you give freedom to immoral people, all they do is immoral things, right? It's like Chicago every weekend. That's not a great place to be on the weekends. There's a lot of issues, right? Freedom only works if you have the underpinning of morality. And to also be clear, when they said religion and morality, they were not ambiguous about that. It wasn't any religion and all religions are the same. No. They were very explicit. It was the religion of Christianity, and the morality was the morality of the Bible. What they're arguing is without Christianity and the Bible, this whole thing is not going to work. And again, why does that matter? Because as we're looking at the reality of our nation, and even as we're coming into Thanksgiving, which is super fun, it's one of my favorite times of the year, Thanksgiving is, for us, something that we've been challenged to do as Christians, but also even as Americans. There should be a head nod back to, we wouldn't even be a nation had it not been God's intervention. And even as we talk about this, I understand when people want to say, but wait, Tim, but America's, all these bad things along the way. Okay, to be real clear on this, America has absolutely done some bad things, but let me give some context for your thoughts. Every nation in the history of the world has done bad things. Do you know why? Because there were people in all of those nations. The reason Jesus came is because all of sin comes short of the glory of God. There's none righteous, no, not one, right? But what we used to acknowledge wasn't, we never thought they were perfect, but we recognized how a perfect God had used them and done something significant through them. Today, when you remove God from the story, you don't understand the significance of what actually happened and what it looks like. And we actually have a couple books my dad and I have written called The American Story. One's The American Story of the Beginnings, one's Building a Republic. And these are things that if you guys want to know more, there's more than 1,000 footnotes in the back of both of these. And the reason that matters is everything I'm telling you, I would encourage you, please don't believe anything I say. Go look it up. Because if you read Acts 17, where the Apostle Paul was speaking to the Bereans, and it said they would not believe anything that he said until they had confirmed it with Scripture. One of the reasons our nation is in as much of a mess as we are in is because we've just believed way too many people for way too long without doing some basic research. And I would encourage you, please don't take my word, but I can say it with confidence because I know what their writings say. I know exactly what they wrote. And this is where, if you want to know more, I would encourage you. These are two great resources. We also, it's called the Founders Bible. It's a normal Bible, which reading the Bible is the most important thing in our life, okay? So if you're going to read a book, the Bible is great. This Bible, what makes it unique is there are literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of quotes from the founding fathers where when they would talk about a specific verse, and how that verse impacted them and maybe their families or maybe even government. The Constitution, we put their quote by the verse. It's footnoted. You can go back to the letter and see it. So it's an amazing way to see how the Bible literally shaped our nation by shaping the men that shaped the nation. But as we finish, I want to close with a couple Bible thoughts as we wrap this up. The first one is Jeremiah 29. Most people know Jeremiah 29:11, if you know a verse from Jeremiah 29, because 29:11 says, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, the plans to prosper you, not to harm you, to give you hope in the future. But most people, if I said, okay, but how does Jeremiah start that? We'd be like, I don't know. Jeremiah 29, he starts, writing to everybody who's carried away captive into Babylon. And he writes them a note of encouragement. He says, don't despair. God hasn't forgotten you. He says, in fact, continue to marry, continue to have kids and raise families, continue to plant crops and grow and harvest. He says, don't stop living. And then he gets to verse 7. He says, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. One of the things that I would encourage, he wrote to people who are literally slaves being taken somewhere they didn't want to be, and he says, but don't lose sight. God's still sovereign, and wherever God has you, you should work to make that place better. In fact, pray to God that it gets better, and there's a practical benefit for you when it does. As believers, this earth is not our home. You are in exile. We are eagerly awaiting the day we can be somewhere else. But as long as we are here, we should seek the best for the place where God has us. And actually even pray to the Lord for it. How do we seek the best? The Bible tells us in Proverbs 14:34 that righteousness exalts a nation. What makes a nation good or successful? The Bible says righteousness. Now, you can think what you want about the last presidential election, but even this notion of make America great again, you can only make her great again if you know what made her great in the first place. What made her great in the first place, according to the Bible, is righteousness. That's what makes a nation good or bad. Well, how do we get righteousness in our nation? That only happens through Christians, because we're the only ones that even understand what righteousness is. We're the only ones that can promote and advocate for the will of God in the same kind of ways. And this is where I want to finish with a challenge. In fact, I want to ask Pastor Morgan, the worship team, if they want to come back up. I want to finish with a challenge for us that in Nehemiah, where Nehemiah goes back to rebuild the wall, part of what he tells the people in the challenge is, come, let us rebuild, that we will no longer be a disgrace. He said, what's happened in our home is disgraceful. We need to go back and rebuild it so that it's not disgraceful anymore. I would argue, if you look at America, the last several decades, there have been some pretty disgraceful things that have happened. And Nehemiah's call was, let's go back and rebuild that. And what I want to encourage and challenge us with, even as we're getting ready for Thanksgiving, I am so thankful, first of all, that we live in a nation where God was so active and visible in the founding and forming of this nation. But I'm also grateful that we are at a time and era where that we can be a part of the future of the nation, that we can work to rebuild part of what's been torn down and restore that God thought back to the nation. And as I say this, let me again remind you, when Thanksgiving started by the Pilgrims, it wasn't because things were going wonderful in their life. Half their people had died, but they recognized God still intervened, or we all might have died. Right? Like, it's not exactly what we want, but we still know who God is. Abraham Lincoln, he declares it a federal holiday in October of 1863, the middle of the Civil War. This is one of the roughest times in America, and yet they recognize that we still need to give God thanks. And I'm saying this because no matter where we are, right? If you're in the high or the low, the mountaintop and the valley, we've been called as Christians to be people that give thanks. But also, in the midst of us giving thanks, I would say, if you didn't know the story, you should also be able to give thanks for the role that God played in the story of this nation, and, God willing, for the role that we get to play in the future of this nation, helping restore some of this righteous foundation. But ultimately, as Christians, we're going to say, in everything, give thanks. God bless you guys. Pastor.
Awesome. Thank you, brother. So good. Such good information. And it really does matter to know what God did in the history of this nation. It really does matter that we rightly understand how God moved into this country and what influenced our founding fathers and what influenced the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. It really does matter that we recognize that God's goodness, favor, and providence was woven strongly through the formation of this country. And people are going to great lengths to erode that. People are going out of their way to cleanse and purge out of our history the God, the creator of the universe's role in this nation. And what should be obvious in hearing, and that was just a snapshot of the types of providential events that God had in these formative years. But what stands out for me in my mind is that if God can providentially create and rise up a nation, then God can providentially dismantle and collapse a nation. Biblically, we know that's true, but we feel like that is something we really see in the back in the day, the kings of old and the ancient of days. That's kind of where we feel like we see such activity. And the American story is an example of God in recent history caring about the condition of a people and displaying as a flagship example to the rest of the world that if you hold to righteousness, which is going to be revealed in Scripture, if you cling to it, if you legislate it, if you institute it into the very fiber of who a nation is, then you could be a great, great nation. And that's what we saw happen. And there is nothing more than the enemy would want than to undo the great work of this nation. And so I would really encourage you. I'm so bummed that a lot of the books and product that Tim has didn't make it today, because I really want this in your homes. I really want this in your kids and your students' hands. I really want them to be informed, because to not be informed is to be ignorant, which is just a version of being misinformed. And this information's so critical. I want for us to be able to stand with confidence and boldness, look, right back into the academics and the critics and say, that isn't true. That is a false narrative. We need to be able to stand, defend, and articulate the truths of this country. So warbuilders.com, I would be really, do you know what would be amazing is if everybody in this church went to their website tomorrow and because of high traffic actually broke their website, collapsed it, and then he sent me an IT bill to get that fixed. I'd happily pay it. So let's see if we can do that. Let's go to the website. So much good products. And I'm not just saying this, I've been using this material for years and years and years. I have, I'll say, dozens of their books, and actually some of their other resources as well, including some caps. Not that it matters, but you can also get a cap there, which looks cool. But I really want you guys to utilize this resource. I mean, you may have been, I don't know, were you guys drinking out of a fire hose at any point today? Yeah, but it's good. This is good. And I really would love for you guys to get your hands on this stuff, unpack it, go through it as a family. Always have extra copies on standby so you can give to people. Hey, listen, read this. Anyway, let's wrap things up. Children's ministry are probably trying to figure out what to do with the kids, and they're probably all out in the parking lot again. That happened. So let's pray, and let's just close in a song together. Lord, you are so good to this country. You're good to us. And righteousness starts with every individual here. That we obey. We walk in righteousness. We model righteousness. We, through your Holy Spirit, through the revelation of your word, we allow your word to control us, and we surrender to it. And as a result, we make beautiful the world around us. And God, we want to influence people. We want to be attractive to the culture, not because we're like them, but because we're different. So God, it starts with us. And I pray, God, that groundswell of reshaping this culture truly would start with us. And so, God, show us how to be more like you, to be a more refined image bearer of you. And so, God, that through that we may hold or we may preserve the beauty of this nation. God, thank you for your grace and your blessing on this country. And just as we go into Thanksgiving, God, I pray that we all would have a sense of thankfulness, gratefulness, contentment, that we would not be ungrateful for anything, even though circumstances and our own lives might be weird. God, that we would see your good hand in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Church, let's stand, let's close in a song.